I knew Bob Krantz was going to be a problem the second he called my 27-page vendor transition guide adorable. Not useful, not thorough. Adorable. Like I'd just handed him a finger painting and asked him to hang it on the fridge. He said it in front of half the department, too, leaning back in his ergonomic chair like some smug discount Bond villain, chewing on sunflower seeds and trying to look like a disruptor. I'd been at Eastvale Dynamics for 16 years. That's not a resume line, that's a warning label. I'd weathered 6 COOs, 3 reorgs, and a 2-year experiment with something called Agile Leadership Pods that ended with a broken projector and a mild HR lawsuit. I knew where the skeletons were buried, hell, I had arranged the funeral logistics. Still, I kept my head down. That's how you survive here. You don't outshine, you outlast what nobody knew. Not Bob, not HR, not even the people in my own department, was that I wasn't just some risk-averse procurement gremlin. I'd gone back to using my maiden name after my divorce, mostly to avoid getting LinkedIn messages from my ex-husband's golf buddies. What that meant, unintentionally, was that nobody connected me to Welker Global. As in, our largest client. As in, the people responsible for keeping Eastvale's lights on. And more importantly, the company my father founded 38 years ago. Yeah, that Welker. My father, Everett Langston, was semi-retired now. Spent more time talking to his koi pond than any board member. But his COO called me twice a week. I'd been quietly managing our interface with Welker's vendor teams for years, optimizing shipments, rewriting compliance language, smoothing out that one Q4 budget crisis like I was ironing a silk shirt on a frying pan. They trusted me. They didn't know me not by name, but they trusted my work. But Bob didn't trust anything older than a tick-tock. First thing he did was nuke my SOPs. Second thing, reassigned my vendors to a guy who once spelled liaison with a Z. Said I was too close to legacy systems. He tossed around that phrase like it was an insult instead of the only reason our contracts didn't look like ransom notes. By the way, real quick before I forget, if you're liking this story, or even just listening to it while hate washing dishes, do us a solid. Tap that subscribe button and throw in a like. 90% of y'all ghost me harder than my last date, and it really helps the team keep making these. All right, back to Bob, so I let him. I watched him strip our department like it was a Pinterest DIY project gone wrong. I smiled when he started saying things like value stream mapping without knowing what a stream was. I nodded when he made jokes about me being the department historian and queen of paper trails. That last one was actually true. I had backups of the backups. I had vendor contracts tagged, time-stamped, and alphabetized in ways that would make a librarian weep with joy. When he removed me from the Welker file entirely, I didn't argue. I just archived every change he made in a folder labeled, in case of emergency, break Bob. See, you learn things when you're invisible. Like which assistant has the CEO's personal number, or how to track edits in boardroom documents without leaving a trace, or how to walk through the building like a shadow, hearing everything, saying nothing. You also learn when to wait, and when to act. The tipping point came when Bob announced the quarterly culture dinner. He pitched it like a morale boost, but anyone who's worked corporate long enough knows it was just an ego pageant with mediocre chicken and a cash bar. I almost skipped it, almost, but something told me to show up. Something in his eyes when he said, "Let's make this one memorable," and something told me that this time I wouldn't be the one who had to keep her head down. Bob Krantz came in like a diet hurricane, lots of noise, barely any substance, and left everything somehow stickier. He had that salesman strut that screamed, "I read a book once," and by book, I mean probably a LinkedIn thread with the word disruption in all caps. The guy had a Bluetooth headset permanently attached like it was welded to his skull, and he kept saying synergy like he got paid every time someone cringed. On his first day, he brought donuts. On his second day, he deleted my vendor continuity tracker. "I've consolidated your documentation into a more dynamic format," he said, meaning. He dumped 16 years of procurement nuance into a color-coded Google sheet that broke every time you scrolled too fast. That was the day I stopped trusting him. Day 3 just confirmed it. "Let's talk optics," he said, pacing in front of the team like a substitute preacher. "Perception is productivity. People need to see us modernizing." I didn't say anything. I just blinked at him from across the table, silently mouthing the words optics won't fix freight delays. But hey, Bob was a man on a mission. A mission to fix everything that wasn't broken. He axed our bi-weekly vendor calls, replacing them with an AI-generated dashboard that once flagged a purchase order for paper clips as a security risk. He removed me from the onboarding process for new suppliers and gave the task to his favorite, Chase, guy who once asked me if net 30 meant 30 emails before payment. Chase also wore cologne you could smell from a different ZIP code and used the phrase circle back like it was punctuation. Bob didn't fire shots directly. He just erased you in increments. He made legacy a dirty word. Every meeting was a TED Talk parody minus the brain cells. "We're streamlining," he'd shout, like a magician pulling rabbits from hats made of bullshit. And every time he rewrote a process or nixed a contact, he'd glance at me like he was expecting applause. I gave him silence. Nothing unnerves a narcissist more than a woman who won't flinch. I knew better than to fight him head on. I've seen people try to outshine managers like Bob. They end up with boxes under their desk and a mysterious restructuring notice from HR. I wasn't about to die on that hill. Not yet. Instead, I moved my backups to a personal drive. I reprinted every vendor NDA he'd sunsetted and filed them in a drawer under my ficus. And I started saying things like that's an interesting approach in meetings while watching him twist his face like he couldn't tell if I meant it or not. Then came the announcement, the quarterly culture dinner. Let's boost morale, Bob said, grinning like a raccoon that just found an open trash can. We'll celebrate wins, acknowledge some longtime contributors, and maybe shake the tree a little. Shake the tree? That phrase rattled in my brain like a loose screw in a jet engine. The email invitation said business casual but included a calendar attachment that blocked off 3 hours and listed mandatory attendance. He was calling it a dinner, but this wasn't about food. It was about performance, optics, a stage. He booked the same banquet hall we used for the holiday party 2 years ago, the one with the peeling wallpaper and a projector that buzzed like a dying bee. It didn't matter. Bob didn't care about aesthetics. He cared about attention, and he was building a spotlight. The week leading up to the event, he was giddy, walking on air, pulling aside VPs with winks and whispered jokes. He even asked if I'd like to sit near the front. Said something like, wouldn't want our longest-running relic in the back. I smiled, wouldn't want to block the exits. He laughed like it was a joke. I didn't. I went home that night and stared at the folder labeled in case of emergency break Bob. Then I made a copy. Labeled it Stage 2, because I knew something Bob didn't. When you shake the tree, you better know whose roots are holding up the damn forest. The dinner was already a slow-motion car crash before the salad hit the table. We were crammed into a room that smelled like overcooked green beans and desperation, the kind of place where every fork clink echoes like a death rattle for ambition. Bob stood at the podium like he was auditioning for America's next top corporate narcissist, dressed in a blazer that still had the Nordstrom tag barely tucked under his collar. The theme of the evening, he declared, was recognizing transformation. And by that, he meant publicly crowning himself king while setting fire to anyone who remembered life before his reign. He started with vague platitudes, name-dropping team members he'd known for 6 weeks like they were war buddies. He praised Chase for revolutionizing vendor communications, which I guess is what we're calling accidentally emailing pricing sheets to a competitor now. He gave a shout-out to the intern who formatted his slides. He even made a joke about how you can always count on Gen Z to explain acronyms to the rest of us. People laughed. They always do. Not because it's funny, but because it's easier than being next. Then he turned toward me. And of course, he said, lifting a glass, we wouldn't be here without the dedication of our long-serving team members. People like Sarah Langston. Where is she? Sarah, stand up. The spotlight hit me like a taser. I didn't move. Bob chuckled, walking toward my table like he was presenting a game show prize. Sarah's been with Eastvale for what, 16 years? That's a legacy in dog years. She's practically part of the furniture. Laughter again. This time thinner, he held up an envelope. As a token of appreciation, we'd like to give you this gift card to get this Office Max. Thought it was fitting, some scattered claps, someone coughed. And Sarah, he added with a smirk that could strip paint, why don't you take the rest of the evening off, go home early, you've earned it, or at least, you've been here. That's when the silence hit. Heavy, gritty. Like ash falling, I stood up, not fast, not dramatic, just deliberate. I picked up my clutch, tucked in my chair, and looked around the room. The faces blurred, but the shame didn't. I could feel the heat rise behind my ears, but my expression didn't change. Because I've learned one thing after years of being underestimated: there is no louder scream than silence when you were expected to cry. I walked out of that room without saying a word. No scene, no tears. Just the click of my heels on carpet and the quiet collective inhale of a room that had seen something shift and didn't know what it meant yet. But someone did. As I passed the catering table near the back, I noticed her, Madeline Jameson, client liaison from Welker Global. She wasn't seated with the executives. She'd been tucked near the buffet, sipping her wine and avoiding eye contact. But now her face was pale, her grip on her phone tight. She stood up as I passed, didn't speak, just pivoted sharply and headed toward the exit behind me. Outside the banquet hall, I caught a glimpse of her through the glass window, pacing near the hotel's valet stand with her phone to her ear. Her voice was muffled but urgent. Not angry, concerned. And then she said it. Yes, her. I didn't know either, but you need to see this now. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I didn't need to. See, Bob thought he was making an example out of me. What he didn't realize was that the room had learned something. Just not the lesson he thought he was teaching. And the next lesson? That was going to be mine to give. I didn't go home, didn't even think about it, really. I got in my car, turned off my phone, and drove 2 hours north to the house with the wraparound porch and the busted mailbox no one ever bothered fixing. My father's place. A colonial monstrosity with more charm than insulation, tucked away behind a line of trees that have been leaning slightly left since the 90s storm. He was in the backyard when I arrived, crouched by the koi pond, murmuring something to the fish like they were old poker buddies. He didn't look up. You're early, he said. I'm not staying. He turned, one eyebrow raised. He hadn't seen my face yet, just heard my voice. But that was enough. My father was a lot of things: stoic, gruff, painfully Midwestern, but clueless wasn't one of them. His eyes found mine and he stood without another word, just dusted off his knees and nodded toward the porch. We didn't go inside. We sat on the creaky swing out front, the same one my mother used to read on before she passed. I told him everything, not just the toast, but the buildup. The months of sabotage disguised as restructuring, the erased sops, the smirks, the condescension, the final knife twist served lukewarm over dry chicken and wilted greens. He didn't interrupt, he didn't gasp, he didn't rage. He just sat there with his hands folded like he was listening to the weather report. That's how he's always been, controlled. But I've learned to read him. And the twitch in his jaw, that was rage. When I finished, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Not the newer one the assistant insisted he use, but the beat-up old Nokia he kept for reasons unknown. He scrolled through his contacts like a man picking targets. Then he called Brennan Carter, Welker's COO. Bren, he said, calm as ever, paused the Eastvale renegotiation. Indefinitely. No PR move, just silence. Let him stew. I heard Brennan's confused reply. My father added, Sarah will explain. Send her the license templates. Use the old ones, then he hung up. No follow-up questions, no pep talk, just execution. That's my father. Nuclear missile in a flannel shirt. I sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then I stood, went to his office. Yes, he still keeps a home office lined with 3 decades worth of printouts and tax law manuals, and pulled up the licensing agreement on his terminal. Eastvale's been using our integration suite for 8 years. Our data layer compliance stack is their spine. Technically, I wasn't part of the licensing process. I wasn't on any paper as a decision maker. But I was the one who designed the workflows between our platforms. I was the one who trained Eastvale's original onboarding team. I was the one who kept the whole damn ecosystem humming through layoffs, restructures, and one glorious malware crisis in 2019. So when I revised that agreement, I didn't do it out of spite. I did it out of necessity. I restructured 3 clauses that allowed us to terminate with 24-hour notice in the event of personnel conflicts. I removed the auto-renewal clause and replaced it with a variable rate licensing model dependent on quarterly review. And I added one very important line. All liaison assignments and communication channels must be approved by the client's designated partner representative. I added my name to that line. And then I sent it to Brennan. The time I got back on the road, it had already started. I had 16 unread emails from Eastvale by the time I hit the on-ramp. Contract team, legal, procurement. Even Chase, bless his bottle blonde soul, asking if I still had the Q2 vendor codes because something's not matching up. They were scrambling, and I wasn't even warmed up yet. Corporate panic doesn't sound like fire alarms or glass breaking. It's quieter than that. It's the sudden absence of buzz, the silence in Slack channels that were chirping 10 minutes ago. It's calendar events disappearing mid-refresh. It's the subtle shift in hallway energy when people start muting their phones not for meetings, but because they're expecting calls they don't want to take. By Monday morning, Bob looked like he hadn't slept. His usual cocksure stride had turned into a nervous shuffle, and he had this tic now, pressing the bridge of his nose like it owed him money. He stormed past my desk twice without saying a word. Normally, he would have made some comment about the number of personal plants I kept near my monitor, like owning a ficus was an act of rebellion. This time, nothing, just 2 passes and a grumble. He didn't know yet that I'd taken a personal day. I wasn't sick. I wasn't mad. I just didn't feel like being there. I figured the silence would teach them more than I ever could. By 10:42 a.m., procurement team was already unraveling. Welker's contract renewal had stalled, frozen mid-negotiation with no warning. No one from Welker was answering emails. The shared Slack channel had gone dark. The compliance portal started rejecting form submissions from Eastvale's domain. It was as if the plug had been pulled from the wall and everyone kept trying to flick the light switch. Chase tried calling me. Twice. Left a voicemail that started with "Hey girl" and ended with "Lol, okay, call me or don't." I didn't. Instead, I forwarded the message to my personal archive labeled passive panic and went back to sipping tea. By noon, the CFO was walking the halls, whispering into his phone. The head of legal was visibly sweating through her blazer. And in the main conference room, procurement had gathered in what looked like a prayer circle of laptops and bad news. Bob, meanwhile, was on his 4th email to the CEO, who hadn't responded to the first 3. His last message I later heard had the subject line urgent, Welker disruption, immediate strategy required. The CEO was still abroad, but his assistant, she'd read it, she'd read all of them, she just didn't forward them. At 1:16 p.m., someone finally tried to use my documentation, an old SOP I'd archived months ago. Vendor Onboarding Protocol, circa 2020. I know this because I'd embedded a redacted watermark across every page. Draft only, contact SL, for final. I got a screenshot from one of the interns. "Is this you?" she asked. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't like her, but because I wanted her to see what silence meant in a place where people only listened to noise. By mid-afternoon, panic had turned to blame. Someone in contracts tried to call Chase out for losing track of the Welker liaison chain. Chase pointed at Bob. Bob pointed at procurement. Procurement pointed at me but then quickly pulled back because technically I didn't exist in the current org chart. I'd been erased, deleted from contact sheets, removed from team leads. According to Bob's own restructuring, I wasn't essential anymore. Which is why, at 3:24 p.m., in a meeting I wasn't invited to, someone finally asked the question that cracked the floorboards. Wait, why is she still listed as primary liaison on the Welker file? A beat of silence. Then another voice, who gave her access? Someone else. Has she always been there? They pulled the logs. I know because one of the junior compliance guys sent me a single skull emoji via text. The answer wasn't just yes, I'd been listed on every Welker file for the last 6 years. Not just as a reviewer, as point of contact, as originator. The system didn't care about Bob's org chart. The system knew who built it. Back in my living room, I turned off my notifications and let my tea go cold. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't angry. I just wasn't available. I let them dig. Let them try to piece together the gap between what they thought they controlled and what they actually understood. And somewhere in a half-empty conference room, Bob was realizing the worst part. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a reveal. Thing about paper trails is that they don't care who's in charge. They don't need your permission to exist. They don't change just because a new manager wants a shinier deck for his next Transformation Tuesday slideshow. They just wait. And when the time comes, they testify. Legal started poking around Tuesday morning. Quietly at first, just trying to find someone to blame without setting off alarms. By noon, it was a full forensic sprint. Compliance systems, email chains, vendor logs, every dusty corner of the shared drive was getting the blacklight treatment. They weren't just looking for answers, they were looking for liability. The thing they didn't expect to find, me. Buried inside the Welker master file, version 117.4a was my name, not just as a CC or a courtesy reviewer, but as primary liaison, S. Langston. Every version for 6 years, every compliance review, every cross-signature request, every single approval logged in the Welker contract history had passed through my hands. They'd stripped me out of the current interface, but the bones still remembered. That's when the Googling started. Someone, probably that same panicked junior from Monday, typed my full name into a browser. Sarah Langston. Up popped an old press release from 2016. Welker Global expands Logistics Division CEO Everett Langston taps daughter Sarah for procurement integration. The link was dead. But the quote was cached. Sarah Langston, who's been instrumental in aligning Welker's vendor strategy with key corporate partners like Eastvale Dynamics. That's all it took. Suddenly, the realization wasn't just administrative, it was familial. I wasn't some disgruntled lifer with a chip on my shoulder. I was the reason Eastvale ever had a relationship with Welker in the first place. And Bob, he'd publicly humiliated me, in front of company staff, in front of Welker's liaison. The meeting that followed wasn't recorded. But from what I was told by a whispery voice note from one of the finance VPs, it went something like this. Bob, it was a misunderstanding. Legal, it was negligence. Procurement, she never told us who she was. Finance, you fired the only person Welker trusted. Board member, flatly, she wasn't fired. Bob, she walked out. Legal, flipping papers after you mocked her. In front of a Welker representative, and then silence. The kind that makes walls breathe. By Wednesday morning, the CEO's assistant updated the office schedule. The CEO's return flight, originally set for the following week, was now arriving that evening. His trip had been cut short. No explanation. No cheerful back in town memo, just a blank calendar block labeled Private Internal Dinner Meeting Welker. Around 11 a.m., Bob received a short directive via email. Just one sentence, prepare talking points for Thursday's dinner with Welker leadership. No bullet list, no prep doc, no agenda. Just a vague, formal threat dressed like a meeting invite, and Bob, he spiraled. He started holding one-on-ones like confessionals, pulling department heads into conference rooms and pleading for insight. At one point, he even tried to grab Chase for context, but Chase was busy fielding panicked questions from the vendors Bob had reassigned him. Half of them were already threatening breach notices. One of them had sent a cease and desist formatted in Comic Sans. Meanwhile, I stayed home. I wasn't on vacation. I was reviewing my own contract archive, prepping a package I never thought I'd need, an annotated record of every Welker Eastvale cross-approval I'd touched since 2017, with notes, with timestamps, just in case. Because if Bob was about to walk into a dinner with Welker thinking he still had a script, he was going to learn what it feels like to open your mouth and realize someone else already wrote the ending. The dinner was held at Cresswell Hall, Eastvale's go-to for events that needed to look expensive but still offered chicken marsala at scale. White tablecloths, folding chairs disguised with satin bows, and just enough dim lighting to pretend no one was panicking. It was invitation only. Executives, VPs, key department heads. Bob insisted it be a leadership moment. A chance, he said, to demonstrate resilience. His words. He'd been workshopping the speech all day, pacing his office like a sitcom politician, prepping for debate he didn't realize had already been canceled. When he walked into the banquet room, he looked like he'd just wrestled his blazer on in a moving vehicle. His collar was askew. His smile was too wide, but he still had that same glint, the one that said he thought he was still the smartest guy in the room. He clinked his glass twice and cleared his throat. Tonight, Bob began, we're here not just to dine, but to reflect on growth, on challenge, on lessons. He paused for dramatic effect, gesturing with his wine glass like he was about to baptize us with Merlot. In any business, he continued, there are seasons. Seasons for planting, seasons for harvesting, and yes, sometimes seasons for pruning. A few chuckles. From his circle, of course, the hangers-on and hope to be promoted. Bob leaned in, letting the silence linger just a second too long. Sometimes, he said, you gotta trim the deadwood, make space for new growth. The laughter this time was thinner, less organic. Someone coughed. Someone else clinked a fork a little too hard against their plate. And just as Bob raised his glass to wrap it up with whatever metaphor he'd probably stolen from a business podcast, the double doors opened. Every head turned. In walked the CEO, alone for a breath. Then came two more sets of footsteps behind him. First, Everett Langston, co-founder of Welker Global. Crisp gray suit, no tie, expression unreadable. His presence was like gravity, a slow hush rippled across the room just from the weight of him walking in. Most people had never met him in person. Some didn't even know he was still involved. And then came me. No fanfare, no spotlight. Just me in a navy-wrapped dress and low heels, hair pulled back, eyes forward. I didn't scan the room, I didn't need to. I knew exactly where Bob was. The CEO walked up to the stage, didn't even wait for Bob to finish his toast. Just clapped a hand on his shoulder, casual but heavy, and said into the mic, Bob, have you met our client's daughter? You could feel the air collapse out of the room like a balloon pinched at both ends. Bob turned. His face went slack. First confusion, then dawning, then that perfect, exquisite shade of pale that only shows up when a man realizes the hole he's in isn't a metaphor. It's a burial plot with his name carved in granite. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply walked past him, past the stunned faces, past the stiffened backs and clenched jaws. I took my seat at the head table next to my father, folded my napkin over my lap, and poured myself a glass of water like it was any other Thursday night. Bob didn't move, didn't speak. He stood there, holding a glass no one was clinking anymore, blinking like he'd been unplugged from reality. And just as the silence reached its apex, Everett Langston leaned in, just loud enough for those closest to hear, and said, let's begin. He wasn't talking about dinner. You could almost hear the click of Bob's grin breaking in real time. That crack between confidence and collapse, that split second when bravado turns brittle. The moment his eyes met mine, the smirk died on his face like a light bulb shorting out mid-flicker. I stood beside the CEO saying nothing, no dramatic entrance, no monologue, just presence, that's all it took. Silence blanketed the room, thick, stunned, suffocating. Someone dropped a fork, it clattered like a gunshot. No one moved to pick it up. Bob blinked, once, twice. Then his head swiveled like a malfunctioning Roomba, trying to scan for context he hadn't programmed for. But he stammered, eyes darting between me and the CEO like he could rewind the evening if he just stared hard enough. She? The CEO said mildly, hands clasped behind his back. You mean the woman who authored the vendor transition system your team's been desperately trying to reverse engineer all week? No response. He let that hang a moment, then added, also the daughter of Everett Langston. A few gasps. Actual gasps. Someone at table 4 muttered, oh my God, which might have been the most honest thing said at an Eastvale event in years. Bob's jaw twitched. No one told me she didn't tell you, the CEO corrected, because she didn't have to. She wasn't here to leverage her last name. She was here to work, to hold this company together while you were busy. Pruning. That last word sliced cleaner than any insult could. Bob's hand still held his wine glass like he wasn't sure whether to toast or hurl it. Meanwhile, I walked, slowly, steadily past the stunned tables, past the faces pretending they hadn't laughed at his jokes, and pulled out my chair at the head table. Right next to my father, I sat, smoothed my skirt, picked up my glass of water and sipped, casual as Tuesday night TV. That faint smile on my face, it wasn't smug. It wasn't revenge, it was restraint. My father gave me a subtle nod. The CEO took his seat across from me, already signaling the server to start the meal. Bob remained standing, a man with a mic and no script. His mouth opened again like maybe this was all some elaborate onboarding ritual he'd been left out of. But no one was laughing anymore. He lowered the mic. And then something even better than shouting happened. People started talking around him, not to him. Conversations resumed. Forks lifted. Glasses clinked. Not for Bob, for us. The night moved on, and Bob stood in that silence he'd carved for me at the last dinner. Alone, diminishing by the second. Because the thing about making an example out of someone, eventually you become the cautionary tale. Bob opened his mouth, probably aiming for something between a strategic apology and a last-ditch save. What came out was closer to a winded wheeze, like the words had abandoned him halfway up his throat. I wasn't aware. If someone had told me, it's not like. This isn't. The CEO didn't yell, didn't even raise his voice. He simply lifted one hand, low, deliberate, and the room paused like someone had hit mute. Bob, he said, voice smooth as glass, we've reviewed your handling of Eastvale's vendor strategy. Bob blinked, trying to recalibrate his face into something professional, something salvageable. He opened his mouth again. The CEO continued, not waiting. Welker has requested your removal from all points of contact. Beat breath effective immediately. The words didn't echo, they landed, quietly, like a gavel made of velvet. Around the room, no one moved, but I saw it. The slow eye contact between board members, the subtle tilt of heads, the tiny nod from legal as they slid a sealed envelope across the linen-draped table, resting it in front of Bob like a gift he didn't want. He stared at it, hands still hovering midair, like touching it would make it real. Your transition will be handled by compliance, the CEO added. Please refrain from making further contact with vendor-side personnel. We'll be issuing an updated stakeholder communication memo tomorrow. Translation, pack your shit and don't touch the printer on the way out. Bob didn't storm out. He just stood there, frozen, as the dinner resumed around him. A man left behind by his own momentum. Still clutching a wine glass, still trying to piece together how the narrative had turned without him. Across the table, I lifted my glass, not in triumph, not in mockery, just calmly, quietly. And for the first time, I looked him in the eyes. Careful, I said. You might teach someone the wrong lesson. Then I drank, and Bob, he finally sat down, but not at the head table, not even with his peers. He drifted toward the back of the room, shoulders slumped, envelope unopened. Man suddenly allergic to attention. He was still there when the dessert trays came out. Still there when Everett stood, thanked the room, and shook the CEO's hand. Still there when people began filtering out, murmuring soft apologies masked as small talk. And me? I walked out without saying another word, because I'd already said everything I needed to, without raising my voice, without burning a single bridge, without lifting a single finger. Just the truth, delivered in silence. Framed in clarity, a freeze frame he'd never escape. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more chaos. Let's make your old managers spill their coffee in fear.